introduction? Do you fancy an introduction?
Could do.
You don't have to.
What are we called?
Yeah, no. Yeah. I'm not ready for this.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Rich. You're listening to Living La Vita Loca, and I am with...
Faz.
You see, it's difficult when the other person throws it to you.
I don't have the name that you could use for different things. Gravy Faz? No, where is it, Rich? Rich and Gravy Faz.
I am with Gravy Faz.
To be honest, like, I can feel my nickname adapting to that and it being
Gravy
completely...
Faz.
Yeah, it would just be natural. It would be fine.
All right, Gravy Faz, what are we talking about?
Gravy. No, we're not talking about gravy this week, although I would. We're going to talk a little bit about our love. I'm going to say we'll start off with that word and see if it's strong enough or too strong.
See how it looks at
the subculture of skateboarding and a little bit like Americana around the late 90s, early 2000s. A little bit about the music to do with that. And that'll be done through the view of us doing our reviews. Now, I'm going to be reviewing Tony Hawk Underground 2 Remix. What? That's definitely like the cool way of playing it on the PSP.
So much vinyl scratching.
That'll sound great on the audio. I need a DJ Hero as reference from last week. And you'll be talking about...
I'm going to be covering Olli Olli. Which...
Olli.
I'm genuinely a little bit disappointed they didn't call it Olli Olli Olli.
Yeah, no.
But hey ho,
Damn those guys.
It's fine.
So we're going to kick off this week. We'll usually do a little bit of weird chat about gaming news and things that we've seen this week. So something that we saw in the news was, I believe it was Microsoft. Were they denied to be buying Activision as a whole? I mean, this is a bad start from me. I'm like, I think I might have seen something in the news at some point about these potential people.
And basically the UK saying, no, good, fair competition, guys. you shouldn't make too big a gaming company.
What do you think about that? Because surely that's just the norm nowadays, isn't it? That I mean, I guess that it's Activision-Blizzard, isn't it? So they've already been amalgamated once into two giant corporations into one name.
Yep.
And they would be going again. But don't Microsoft kind of own them anyway, in a way? Like, my understanding is that most things that come out from that company, like Call of Duty, for example, are a bit like on the leash of Microsoft / Xbox, aren't they?
A little bit. I mean, there's been plenty of like PlayStation exclusive Call of Duty bits and bobs before now, or like early releases of map packs and all that kind of not stuff that actually matters, basically. Yeah. But people are trying to convince you it does.
You've just upset 3 listeners.
No, bring it on, all 3 of you. I don't care. I think it would matter less if Microsoft hadn't already recently acquired Bethesda.
Okay.
And so you could just kind of see it snowballing a little bit, and it already feels a little bit maybe a touch, but without wishing to get into too old man yelling at cloud territory, like, it doesn't really feel like it matters anymore if you buy an Xbox or you buy a PlayStation. Like, they're very similar.
Yeah.
Back in the day, if you bought a Mega Drive or a SNES, it mattered. You would get different games. They would play differently. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, it almost doesn't matter.
Do you know, I want to challenge you on that a little bit, just because I feel like it does matter now more than it did 5 years ago. So I think I think there's starting to become this exclusivity in terms of some games, more so than they used to be, and I think that is on the back of these sort of picking up different businesses and rolling them
these
into
acquisitions, kind of turning into two tribes, kind of thing.
I think there is more of that now than there used to be maybe 5 years ago. Now, at the start of, when I say the start, what am I talking about here? I guess the start of time, But I guess when you'd say maybe when we'd built into that contest where you had Nintendo, Microsoft had built itself up to, say, the 360, for example, and you had the PlayStation 2/PlayStation 3 kicking around. Like, I think there was a bit of a challenge there where it was like, oh yeah, we want to have our exclusive games, but people weren't necessarily kind of onto it. They weren't like, oh, that makes me feel like I need to buy this console. I'm just going to do what I want to do. And then I think we went through a bit of a lull where there was just a hodgepodge of everything, really, apart from, like, for example, Halo.
Yeah, true.
But then I feel recently I've seen more and more games start to be, right, this is a PS5 game, or this is an Xbox Series X game. And I do start to see that there's almost that brand splitting a bit more. You could. I think you're probably actually onto something. Thinking about it, because I mean, look at Final Fantasy and stuff like that. That's a quick example to point out and go, well, it's not like you can play all of those everywhere. No. You can play the Pixel ones, as we discovered this week, didn't we? The new Pixel.
Quite expensive.
Yeah, £65. Would you, if you'd never played them before? I've not played 1 to 6 at all, but I hear great things about like 2 and 4, I think it is.
Yeah, if I bought it, it would be because I absolutely love Final Fantasy VI.
Right.
It wouldn't be for
any
another
other reason.
Surely
you could buy Final Fantasy VI for cheaper.
I already have it about 3 times over in different ways.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's no real incentive. Although I did look to see if it was possible to pick up like a snazzy collector's edition or something, just in case, because I'm a sucker for these things. But
just in case.
No, yeah, just an emergency copy of Final Fantasy VI.
So. Yeah, I don't really have an opinion particularly, like you say, on... That's good podcasting, isn't it? I don't have an opinion. Thanks, bye now.
On big business and acquisitions.
What I'm trying to say is that I don't feel like it affects me too much at the moment. And if it happened, I think I'd probably still get everything I wanted. I think it probably affects like that fair play in big business, the city sort of situation. Yeah. Does it affect you as a gamer too much?
I don't think so. I think they... Who's they in this, Richard? Come on, think. I think Microsoft and Activision-Blizzard did try to make sure that they were saying pretty clearly in the run-up to all of this stuff, like, it's not like PlayStation players can't play Call of Duty anymore, and that sort of thing. Yeah. So I think day in, day out, it wouldn't make a difference. But I think you're right. I think probably what spooked the powers that be would be like, it does kind of set a bit of a precedent.
Yeah.
And, that's before you get into the realms of, like you were kind of alluding to with the Imperial March there, Microsoft and hybrid working and office stuff, and like they're everywhere as it is. Like, do they need to really be snowballing game studios and going sort of bigger and bigger and hoarding this lot? Arguably not, but it'll be interesting to see what happens, and ultimately, I don't think it will really change a heck of a lot, but it's just interesting that it's another way that video gaming is getting covered in like mainstream news outlets and things like that. Yeah,
it's true. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting to think that it's worth so much big money now. Big Gravy. There we go. Get that pot back in there. Gravy Faz. Sponsored by Big Gravy. Yeah, I think there's the amount of money now in video gaming is astronomical, but as alluded to by Nathan on the pod last week, who talked about how like it's not just video gaming, it's like gaming in general. I mean, they always cite Activision-Blizzard, owner of Candy Crush, and I'm like, God, Candy Crush, but then I don't play Candy Crush anymore.
Matters to a lot of people.
It matters to a lot of people, yeah, exactly. And I used to play a lot of Candy Crush for free. I'd never paid for it, and then I used to hate myself, and I was like, oh, I ran out of all the shitty lives that I need. I need to get back on Candy Crush. I need it back in my life. Speaking of Candy Crush, should we talk about our beers?
Yeah. So I was in Otley at the weekend.
Hooray!
Hooray for
Olli Olli Olli. Otley.
Yeah, sure.
That's going to work at some point during this pod, I'll tell you.
Yeah, we'll workshop it. I was in the Curious Hop at some point, little bottle shop, and I've got a Turning Point Night Lapse coffee porter. I think these guys are from Knaresborough. So well done, Knaresborough. That is perfectly quaffable.
I've had some of those before, and They're pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's quite a life affirming experience, but it's good. It's good stuff. What have you got?
I have got a Lemon Days Cloudy Lemonade IPA, and that's from Magic Rock Brewery in Huddersfield. I used to drink quite a lot of Magic Rock when I worked at Marks and Spencer's because they were one of the first shops to take on the brewery.
Really?
Yeah, and I really enjoyed their. Is it Raspberry Goes? I think it was. It was like a sweet and salty.
They do
sweet
quite
and
big
salty.
flavours,
Yeah,
don't they?
a sweet
Yeah.
and salty kiss. It was called, or something like that. And it was absolutely amazing. And I think they kind of discontinued that, and I was a bit disappointed about that. And they rebranded, but they still do some really, really good beers. And like you say, big flavours and that. If I'm having one or two, I like a big flavour beer. So, big gravy flavour.
Gravy Faz, he says. Yes.
The man from Gravy Milan says, okay! So, let's get down to business.
Right. Is that a proposition?
I was trying to remember the next line of the lyric from Eminem, if I'm going to be perfectly honest.
How's that going for you?
Yeah, it's not going well. No. It's going really shit.
Right.
So, yeah, let's talk a little bit about what we came to talk about today. And I think it is a labour of love between us as friends. And we've talked about it before, but we've talked about it a lot before, but I think we're probably going to get into it in a whole new level probably now tonight. So, skateboarding. Woo! Skateboarding games, skateboarding culture. Before we review our games, I can see in front of me there are 4 decks, skateboarding decks, for anyone that isn't on the lingo there, in Rich's bedroom here. Spare room. Oh, back off the bedroom comment. Spare room. There's no... it's okay. This is all okay. And I'm looking, and I am impressed, A, that you have 4 decks, and B, that they look so frigging cool, and C, you've got a plethora of different types there. So you are what I would call a skateboarder. I
am what I would call a twat.
Nobody said that out loud until you did.
I definitely said it out loud because I'm a twat.
Why are you indeed a twat? Can I ask?
Yeah, like I way back when, I was always kind of curious about skateboarding. Like I was one of those kids that grew up with Jackass and like Transworld Sports, I think, and all those kind of things. Obviously, as we'll doubtless get into later on, like the Tony Hawk soundtracks and things like that, and they came along, particularly Pro Skater 3. Like you fire it up and you have Ace of Spades blaring out at you and stuff like that, and like that soundtrack is almost like part of my soul now. Like that was an awakening, that soundtrack for me. And to a lesser extent, the first Tony Hawk's Underground one was as well. But they both kind of came along around a time when, I was just starting to sort of get into music myself and kind of go on that journey of, you hear a band, you get into a band, and then you find out who influenced them, and then you kind of, follow that trail of breadcrumbs and see where you end up. And so I was ending up sort of getting around like the Sex Pistols and Ramones and stuff like that. And it was helped by the fact that around this time, like myself and my dad would go and do the family weekly shop while my sister was playing netball, which would mean that once we'd finished the shop, we'd have to sit in the car and wait for her to finish playing netball. And so like I'd quite often buy cheap CDs from Tesco, and like my dad would be like, "Oh yeah, no, I know that lot from when I was when I were a lad, and all that kind of stuff." So like many's the hour that I was sat, in Dad's car, and we were just both listening to the Ramones or whatever. So like there's a lot of happy memories there, and myself and my friends, like there was this shop in Reading, like near where I grew up, called Hard Edge, which is where all the Grebo kids would shop for their clothes. None of us could skate.
Can I just stop you there? So Grebo.
Yeah.
Grebo. I'm well familiar with Grebo. That isn't like that is a term to me. But I guess for our listeners that might not be aware or affiliated with Grebos, what would you describe them as?
So round my way, in my school, we were the kids who listened to rock, metal, punk, emo, I guess as well, if you want to split it off for its own thing. And we'd be the ones that were dressing in baggy jeans and would quite often have the chains on the wallets and stuff like that. And,
My least favourite trait on anybody.
I never had one myself, but I knew plenty of people who did.
Now that's a twat.
That is a twat. But yeah, there was definitely a kind of none of us were very, very good at being musical. A couple of people were, but none of us were skateboarders either. A couple of people dabbled, but it was the sort of thing that all of us kind of fell for this sort of subset of.
So, I mean, I guess that I should speak at this point to say that what I feel about it, but there's very little more that I can say than what you've already said in terms
Does it
of
sound
probably
familiar?
So familiar. Having a dad that I'd come in from school. My dad used to work in a baker's, so he'd always be in because he worked early hours, and I'd get home, and sometimes he'd just sitting there watching Kerrang, and I'd be like,
"Oh yeah, there you go, yeah."
Dad,
Scuzz.
what are you?
What
are you? Scuzz! Oh my days! Scuzz probably sounds as good as this podcast does nowadays. That was lo-fi, that channel. But even having music channels as well, at the time, that was something you don't have anymore. I've lost the art of listening to music and new music, probably from not having music channels to really kind of just, I guess, skate through.
Well, they were the radio for us, weren't they? They just be on in the background.
They were, and this sort of dabbling in skateboarding. I had two friends, probably three friends, who were pretty good at it. Would kind of maybe moved on to kick flips and a couple of heel flips and stuff off ramps and things.
Something.
Yeah,
further than anyone I knew.
Yeah, and I would sit on the basketball court they were doing that on and kind of watch them, and I'd jump on the board after they were finished because it wasn't my deck, and I'd try and semi do an ollie and things, but I just wasn't very good at it either. But like you said, and this is the point I wanted to come back round to, it was an infatuation with that subculture of skateboarding and everything that surrounds that was what really drove me, and it was almost, it's like a kinship in a way.
Yeah, you find your people, don't you? Yeah. And it is the sort of thing that there were plenty of kids at my school who, some might be more into music, some might be more into skateboarding, some might be more into longboarding. Certainly I knew quite a couple of longboarders. It was arguably bigger than skateboarding, in the traditional sense. Yeah, round my way.
That's a southern thing right there.
I think it was, yeah. But at any rate, like finds like, and they certainly did at my school. And yeah, there was a sizable chunk of us were all kind of on the peripheries or around this sort of this skateboarding thing in some way, shape, or form. And so yeah, I had a couple of friends who were big into longboarding, I'd never really dabbled with it, but always wanted to give skateboarding a go. And so my first deck was one that I picked up after I got made redundant when I was living in London, and I was coming up to, it might have been, I can't remember if it was my 25th or my 30th birthday. God, that's bad. It must have been my 25th.
Wow.
A big-ish birthday. Was getting made redundant, and I was like, right, I'm buying a board and I'm going to learn to skateboard before this birthday. And said as only a person who's never done it before could say, because anybody that's even remotely tried will know that is not going to happen. And so, I managed to get up on the board and good enough to roll around a little bit, and that was enough. But it was also enough to sort of make me go, actually, this is kind of fun, and I kind of want to explore it a bit more. And that's where you end up with me getting a longboard, because by this point I was realizing that actually most of the places that I was going to be skating, I'm never going to be good enough to do kick flips and all that kind of stuff, not least because I'm a doughy lad with destroyed knees. I'm not ollieing shit, but a longboard, yeah, sure, I can use that to get around and all that kind of stuff, and did for quite a while. And then you fast forward to last year actually, and I got a slightly bigger than my first one, sort of standard skate deck, again with the aim of having something to cruise around a little bit on. But by this point, we were going down to the park locally a little bit, and I was starting to dabble with trying to do a couple of tricks and things like that. And felt that if I had a bigger board, I might be able to feel a bit more comfortable on
Bust bigger tricks.
Well, just stay on it.
Bones.
Yeah, bust bigger bones. And that kind of coincides with the part where the kind of skate punk side of things, like kind of gave way to like this more sort of meditative side, which sounds really stupid, but
No,
like
it doesn't. It sounds great.
Over time, like the sort of raucous, thrashy, like skate bro kind of side of things, kind of gave way to this whole other side of skateboarding for me, and I would quite often go down to the park like 6 a.m, be the only person there, like no music, like just me and like, you know, a little bit of passing traffic and bird song and like hazy sunshine and the board. And you know, like I say, I'm not good at it, right? But I enjoy the process of trying things with it. And so over time, like the kind of skate punk side of things became almost like this kind of, well, the chill hop version, I guess. And, you know, like I used to read a lot of Huck magazine. So like plenty of people would see the Thrasher logo and have that like ping of nostalgia.
Yeah.
As do I. Like, you know, find me someone our age and inclination that doesn't. But Huck was always the one that I gravitated to a bit more. And that was like washed out colours, abstract photography.
Yeah.
It was more about the kind of the vibe of it rather than the raucous side of things. And so like this all kind of came together a bit more recently, and I started appreciating like freestyle a bit more and that side of skating and like the flat ground stuff. I mean, you've seen me play Tony Hawk's. I love flat ground tricks. Like
you always beat the shit out of me on Tony Hawk.
And I thought, you know what?
I am always the horse. Or worse, usually.
It led me earlier this year to picking up like a second-hand freestyle deck, but then putting like newer wheels and trucks and stuff like that on it, which brings us up to 4. And yeah, I'm really enjoying that kind of like quiet, contemplative type side of things with it. And like, this is why, you know, gameplay-wise, for me, like if you play something like Session, that captures how I see skateboarding in 2023 much more than something like a Tony Hawk's game or something like that. So like, and that's what I love about it. And I hopefully this is what this whole spiel has highlighted, is there's just so many facets to it and so many ways you can approach it.
Yeah.
And that's what's awesome about it.
I mean, getting to that point there was really revelatory.
Yeah. Gravy.
Yeah,
it was
really gravy for me. It felt gravy. Hearing you speak about it there, that sensation, and this is why I feel such kinship with you as well, is that being alone isn't a bad thing sometimes. That is so having that moment where you are choosing to go and do something, and it's almost a bit on the abstract side of things, in so much that it's like, you know, how many people are going skateboarding in a local municipal park at 7 a.m. in the morning in the middle of summer just to kind of get that experience. Like you're driving that experience to make you feel that way, and it's almost and I get that same sort of buzz and feeling when I get into that sort of zone or mode if I'm doing something. You know, it sounds a bit strange, but I quite like walking in the dark now, and that's completely different sort of kettle of fish from what we'll talk about on the podcast. I don't want to go down that avenue too much, but almost that where you quite solitary, but you know there's things going on around you, and you kind of have those moments where you're just a bit relaxed and you're listening to your music, or maybe sometimes you're not, you're just listening to the passing traffic and things. You know, you get into those moments, and it's funny how you've developed as a person from, this is all about the thrash, the skate, the destroy, but actually what you're probably always working towards is the kind of person you are now, and almost that's the culture that you want to be in, that sort of, I guess it sounds like silly, but a between 30 and 40-year-old skater.
It's the mellowing.
Yeah.
It's mellowing is what it is. I'm pleased that I am comfortable with that.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's like, well, you say about who else is going to be down there. I can tell you, there's a couple of people that will sometimes go down there,
But they've got chai lattes in their pockets, haven't they?
Yeah.
Yeah,
They do. One of them would go and he'd start tearing up the bowl. You can tell he'd been doing it for years, but he'd turn up, cup of coffee in one hand, he'd pop it down, and then just spend the better part of probably 2 hours just shredding this pool. And then there's this other guy who, if anything, is older than me and more of a beginner than me, and it's great. It's absolutely incredible to see older people and people my age out and just giving it a crack.
Yeah.
Because like you don't have to be, you know, some high flying kickflip master or anything like that to get something out of it, and that is what is incredible about it.
I feel like whenever I go down memory lane, which I tend to do a significant amount, I don't know if other people are the exact same thing. And I know this podcast is, I guess, lent to do that, but at the same time, whenever I go back to think about that time with my friends and doing those things and listening to that music and taking in the sort of skateboarding, jackassy kind of feel of things, that feels like I almost, when I have that memory, it's almost like taking a drug. Like, as in, so I kind of get that buzz, that feel where I'm like, oh God, that's how I felt. Like, you know, knowing that we are going to Slam Dunk Festival in a month's time with some of our friends who listen to this podcast, very good friends, and that buzz, knowing that's going to happen in a month, where we're going to go and rock out to some punk and just go crazy for a day, that I'm so excited for the next month. I can't wait for that. But I know in my heart of hearts that isn't something that I want to be doing all the time anymore.
Yeah, that's not week in, week out thing.
No, it's it's almost like a little quick dip into that life again. And I love being able to reminisce about that and think, God, that kick, I still get it in my stomach. I still get that feeling where I'm like...
And you always will.
Yeah, and that's great that it's there, but I know that it's led to different things, like you say, that mellowing and stuff where you are now. And it's almost like a learning process of, you know, you've gone from this part of your life to this part of your life. And the reason I want to talk so in depth about these kind of games as well, as a whole, and then go into the feelings about it, is that I wouldn't be the person I am today without Tony Hawk Pro Skater or Thrasher Skate and Destroy. And then, like you say, almost the mellowing of skating games into Skate and into Skater. I've never played Session, but I'm aware of it. And, and it's you know, and then the almost like, I see Olli Olli, like from what I've seen of it as well, and I know you'll go into it a bit more, is almost like it's like a skill based sort of thing where it's actually you're still in a fun cartoony world, but even though it's all bright and colourful and fun, it feels like a bit more of a grown-up game almost in a way from Tony Hawk, because you're not there to be doing all the magical tricks that you can do in Tony Hawk and things. But yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that without that first sort of feeling of playing that game and feeling so at home with it, and then people gathering around that in the same feeling, I wouldn't then have become who I am now, who I'm, I guess, happy with, I guess, as a person. Yeah. You know, that is...
No, I completely agree with that. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think feeling at home with it is a really accurate way of putting it, because that's exactly what it was. And I mean, like, you know, getting into, say, Ramones, right? You know, you listen to it and you think, oh, yeah, like, well, I could play that on guitar, right? Like, how hard can that be? So you start dabbling, and lo and behold, yeah, you can pick it up. And then you're playing it in a garage, and then like you're playing it in garage with your mates and all that kind of stuff. And then like you fast forward however many years, and here we are around a ramshackle podcasting setup, and it's still that kind of DIY ethos. And
yeah, it is,
you know,
isn't
we
it?
just, that first episode, we tested it, it sounded half decent, so we put it out. And that ethos doesn't leave you. You just apply it in a different way. That's all it is. And so like I still very much feel like the snot-nosed punk kid that I was, despite the fact, you know,
just blow your nose, man.
But like, you know, I was never that kid that would, you know, I'd always be like, you know, well presented in my school uniform and stuff like that, and like the slightly nerdy one. But it was really, really refreshing to know that there was music out there that like could speak to me on a very personal level, and it was the same sorts of music as, you know, such and such a person who was completely different to me, and such a person who was completely different again.
Yeah. And
yet we all had that in common, and that centre point, that common ground, stood me in really good stead over the years. And so yeah, like I absolutely owe a hell of a lot to the Tony Hawk games.
Yeah, and I know we're leaning hard talking about the Tony Hawk games, but I guess that's what we experience the most of. It's the most high profile of games. You look at Metacritic. Oh, I did it again. Metacritic again. That's it. That weird bug podcast. That's it. So yeah, speaking about those scores, Tony Hawk 3, Tony Hawk 2 regularly feature as some of the most well-reviewed and important games to a lot of people. And a lot of people probably aren't into the culture necessarily. They just like playing the games. But they were just so popular at the time. And everybody I knew would have played a Tony Hawk game at some point. Maybe not owned them, but certainly would have played them around a friend's house.
Oh yeah, they were big multiplayer ones for us.
And it's just I never knew anything like it. And maybe some people played it and never really kind of got into it, like the culture-wise, and they were just like, oh, that's a fun game. And some people would have been like us, where it was like, this just defined who we were and what we wanted to be at the time. So I guess it's really important to say that franchise certainly shaped it. And whilst there has been probably better skating games in terms of realism and things, in terms of, for me, Tony Hawk isn't about how good skating is. It's almost just, this is the culture you can buy into, and that's what it want to be around. Yeah,
and I think you hit the nail on the head there, where I think by virtue of the fact that it had, say, the music, there's plenty of people that could play it for the soundtrack, but then there's plenty of people that would approach it for, well, it's just a fun game, like you said. That, to me, is actually a really, really good encapsulation of the various facets of skateboarding, and the different things that people can get out of the same activity, I guess, for want of a better word. And so, in that respect, it's a good representation of the sport, because it can mean so many different things to so many different people.
Do you watch any skateboarding nowadays?
I tend to watch a little bit on YouTube, and there's a couple of freestyle skaters who were kind of learning and instructing as they go, but have also tapped into that kind of mellower, laid-back vibe that I really, really like. I know BBC have had some park stuff recently.
It was the British Championships, I want to call it.
Yeah,
and was that last weekend? I think it was.
Might have been a couple of weekends back now.
And that was interesting just to turn on for a sort of even. I'm not gonna lie. I think I watched it for about 8 or 9 minutes because I was busy dad life and stuff.
Yeah.
But I wanted to sit down and watch it for 3 or 4 hours.
I want to make sure they get the viewing figures a little bit. People are out there who appreciate these things.
But even that was quite difficult to view. That is, so it wasn't like you couldn't just watch it on the BBC Sports website. Most sports are embedded in that. If you want to pick it up, highlights and things like Match of the Day, for example, you could just watch that on the BBC Sports website. You had to go to iPlayer, and then iPlayer kind of almost was doing a bit of a thing where it was live streaming from the website of the British Skateboarding Association. Right. So it wasn't easy to do, and I was like, you still make it difficult for people to access extreme sports. Almost like, because the word extreme is there, therefore you're making it on the edge of society. And it's like, you don't need to do that. There will be people that will pick it up and watch it. Make it easier. I find it incredibly difficult to access extreme sports really regularly. Red Bull, I've got a great app.
I used to watch a fair bit on Red Bull.
Red Bull TV is a great app. But again, I would say their calendar's a bit... even with notifications on, it's a bit hit and miss whether or not it tells me what's going on, and it doesn't really choose the sport for me. It'll tell me, well, there's World Rally Championship on. And not that I wouldn't watch that, I'd be into that too, But if I specifically want to watch a skateboarding contest or something, it's difficult to kind of pick that up. X Games, for example, weirdly, X Games, it still feels like you have to go to them to get the information. It's not like, I swear it's something like that. You can only really get it on their website, and their Instagram's like, oh, this is what happened 3 days ago at X Games. I'm like, what do you mean 3 days ago? I want to watch it live, you fucking idiots. It's like, you want people to be involved, and it's almost like, is that part of the culture, do they kind of protect themselves a little bit and say, not everybody can access this, and not everybody can come to X Games, and not everybody can watch this? Is there a bit of a protective bubble from that side of things. Maybe it isn't the mainstream that's got the problem.
I would disagree with that.
Good. It's a bad take.
Because I think obviously the Olympics is probably an easy example to point at and go, well, you know, that got plenty of exposure, and certainly for things like X Games, they had plenty of stuff on YouTube and things like that when it was going on. Sure, there are barriers. I think ultimately, in the grand scheme of sports and numbers of people watching sports, it's probably not going to pull numbers like, say, football would. But that does make me wonder, like, because I don't have Sky or anything like that. You know, it may well be floating around on, I don't know, ESPN or something like that.
ESPN is still because they were the first people that created the X Games. They are probably the best place to go to,
right?
And therefore, that's in our country through BT Sport. But it's just a bit of a shame, really. I think that, for example, we have literally one of the best skaters in the world consistently at the moment, Sky Brown. I mean, and that will continue for years, I would assume, given her young age, and her skill level is insane. To see that doesn't necessarily get as much pop as I'd like it to, certainly. To say that, you know, we have one of the best in the world represent our country, it just doesn't get sang about as much as I'd like it to. And I guess that's me being really petulant and protective about the sport. But
no, but it's a fair point.
You know, I'm not, whilst we're having this conversation, I'm not an embedded skater. I don't read, you know, Thrasher Mag and things like that, you know, and I'm not out there all the time and talking to people. I'm not in all of the skate shops and things. So it must be frustrating for people that are into that to think that that's not necessarily there. Or maybe they do a better job going to find it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's a skate shop in Leeds that, you know, obviously I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I hang out there or anything like that. But when I was in there one time, and this would be last year, a couple of people were having a chat about one of the parks in Leeds, and they were basically complaining about the designers and, you know, why they decided to use concrete in a certain part or not, and you know they were getting into the proper nitty-gritty of it, but the point is that from that chat it sounded as though they were much more concerned with making the sport accessible to people at the grassroots level around the city rather than televising it. They were more concerned with making sure that they could put on an event, you know, in a weekend or two's time where people could travel and go and, you know, have a bit of a competition, but it would draw a crowd and show people. So I think you're probably right in that it's not as accessible on telly and things like that. But certainly in Leeds, there is quite a lot, or there seems to be quite a lot of work going on to make it accessible for people. And certainly there's quite a few parks in Leeds and places that you can go and skate. And I could name plenty of other cities and towns that don't have anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, that would be evidenced in, so there's two huge indoor parks in Leeds that, I've never been to, but I want to. And I'd like to go and just kind of hang out like the coffee shop there, maybe check out a few people, just, you know, putting a few runs down or something like that, or go and see some of the charity events. And even then they've got like roller skating going on and things like that, and I kind of want to get my kids to kind of experience that. And even if they're not necessarily into it, it might not be something they want to do, at least to kind of know that that's there as a different type of alternate sport from what you guess you'd say traditionally would be the main sports in this country, certainly. You know, there's one called LS10 that I've got my eye on. They do mini skating, but they do beginner skating for adults and everything, and they do sort of lots of different nights. They've got jams going on, and I'd love to just go down there and kind of like absorb it in a little bit. And like you say, Horsforth's just had a brand new skate park built. What was it, 2 years ago now? But you know, to have an actual bowl in your local park,
that's ridiculous.
Yeah, I know. It's
ridiculous.
Just, you know, and again, I speak of my friend Betty, who we spoke about last week, twin brother of Nathan, and even Nathan themselves. That they, you know, Betty used to work for Carlisle City Council and was there when skate parks were being constructed around there, and it was almost like being part of the actual associations of people trying to get, like you said, that grassroots vibe going around skating. in the most northern city in the country of England, and it's almost it's a bit of a sort of like an outpost really, compared to say coming down further down south, and to see people getting into that, even just having a couple of ramps kicking about and seeing people, and people came out for it, and kids come out for it, and it's like, oh, that's great. There are people there that want to use these facilities, so they should continue to be built, and it should continue to be supported, and hopefully it will thrive in this country.
Absolutely, and like what was kind of cool about moving up to Leeds and still having my my skateboards was that like it kind of gave you a slightly different way of getting to know the city, and like so through the skate shop and things like that, I know they've put out videos, and like obviously you go walking around city centre on a Saturday afternoon or whatever, and you see various places, and then suddenly you see some of these spots popping up in the local skate shops videos on YouTube or whatever, or even a couple of the magazines. Like there is a distinct northern flavour to skateboarding, and there are some pretty famous spots have come from Leeds, and they're not necessarily all kicking around anymore still, but it's been interesting rather to learn a bit more of the city through that lens. It's
Leeds University is built to be a pro skating level on a game.
Like
doesn't it? It looks
Tony
incredible.
Hawk's. Yeah, absolutely.
You'd feel like you could it'd definitely be a grinding level though, wouldn't it? There'd be a lot of rails.
Quite heavy, yeah. And like there'd be a couple of bits around like the stairs on some of the Brutalist buildings.
Yeah, and like a security guard chasing you around the pond where the fountains are. I can see it now.
Well, let's talk Tony Hawk then.
And I'm like, come on, Rockstar Leeds, if you still exist, I don't think you do anymore. We'll have to get onto a gaming company in Leeds, man. Come on, guys, lay one down. So this is Tony Hawk Underground 2, 2005 from the PSP, and it, as I said at the start of the pod, remix. So what that meant really was that it added 4 extra levels into it. So
4 is not to be sniffed at.
That is not bad, really, is it?
Yeah.
Considering how many goals you can set in a Tony Hawk's game, that's a significant amount of game time, really, and you would have paid less than you would have for the initial release on PlayStation 2 and other consoles at the time. So when I played it, it felt just like Tony Hawk's. The mechanics are excellent. They've ported it over so well. There's nothing that you would say is any different from when you're playing a normal Tony Hawk's game on a home console, and it looks good. That is in it. Again, this will be the sort of third week in a row where I say I'm shocked at the power of the PSP and how it looks for games back then, and how I'm not offended by how a game still plays nowadays. Whereas before we started this project, I'm calling it a project. Fuck it, doing it. I would have thought that it would have looked terrible.
It's not an unfair assumption, is it?
On such a small screen, and I was just like, I can do this. I can do this now in 2023 with bad eyes, they've been warped by shitty Candy Crush, and it looks fine. I can see what I'm doing. I can see the tricks I'm doing, and the controls are responding exactly how they should be to me being able to do these tricks, which, as we've just alluded to, Tony Hawk's Fast and Furious, a lot of button bashing in terms of making tricks happen. You can obviously be a very good Tony Hawk's player and make tricks happen, or you can just mangle the pad and end up getting 12 points for the same trick you've been doing over and over again. Why am I not getting more for my varial heel flip? Because you pressed it 17 times. But you can do that though. The PSP is absolutely a great machine to play this game on. There is a little bit of a caveat with that. Again, and it's the same as what I mentioned last week when we were talking about Tekken. You cannot use the analog stick to play the game.
What, at all?
It rotates your camera on the skater.
Oh,
when you
okay.
when you get off your board, as you can on Tony Hawk Underground, which I want to say at that point, I've never been a massive fan of that feature in this franchise. I understand the evolution that was needed in Tony Hawk Underground, and I really loved Tony Hawk Underground 1. But I didn't. Doing the off the board tricks was fun, but getting off the board and kind of running around and stuff, like a bit like sort of Grand Theft Auto 8, not that fussed for particularly. Okay. That's just a personal thing of mine. I mean, and no, how do you feel about that? I don't know.
I liked it at the time on Underground, but then I think at the time it was probably a novelty as much as anything else, because you've had however many Pro Skater games where you're glued to the board. And it was kind of nice to have the options when it came to extending combos or starting them, and things like that. But yeah, in the cold light of day in 2023, I think it's probably better seen as a stepping stone to something like in Skate or something like that gets a little bit more sophisticated with putting down markers for starting and stopping lines rather than a sort of gameplay mechanic in itself.
Yeah. So yeah, just it kind of offended me that I still had to use the directional pad. And I feel like I've beaten down the directional pad a little bit the last 2 weeks. I'm not trying to, but I think when you get used to these games where you have to spin around or move quickly, as you do in fighting games or as you do in Tony Hawk's, rotating and trying to get into a manual using a physical up and down button is really tough. That is to be able to do that and kind of link all your tricks together, which after... I think it was Tony Hawk 3 introduced reverts. Now, manuals have always been in Tony Hawk's, but reverts into manuals was Tony Hawk 3. And obviously, analog sticks were well in by that point.
Yeah.
So to go back to a directional pad, but that being a necessity to be able to score highly, really fucked me off. So, yeah, you know, that was probably my biggest gripe in terms of how it played in the PSP. But as a port in general, it's pretty good.
Yeah.
I've never played Tony Hawk Underground 2. I kind of stopped playing Tony Hawk's probably after Underground, I'd say, really. I did have a brief stint with Ride because I got it for 10. I think I've said this before on the pod. I got it for £10 from Kex. And take that, Kex. And I tried to play it, and it was as unplayable as people had said it was. Right. And it's regularly ranked as the worst Tony Hawk game. And we will be doing a pod on game peripherals and some peripherals, and we will be doing that at some point in the future. But yeah, that will probably not rank super high on that. I will have it in the ranking, but be prepared to have it at the bottom of your feet. But yeah, so the actual game itself, quite a lot of content in a good way. There's a story mode and classic mode, which I can't remember if that started to be a thing. It's, or it did start to be a thing around about that time in Tony Hawk, where they were like, oh, we're going to give you more bang for your buck. It wasn't just classic mode. It wasn't your 2-minute run. It was story mode. You didn't need the story mode in this. That is in the story mode. So this is another little, I guess, caveat of mine, is effectively just an episode of Viva La Bam. So it's Bam Margera versus Tony Hawk's team. And you end up, I think that you always get inserted on Tony Hawk's team.
Right.
And Bam's like the antagonist, and he's like, all right, butt farts or whatever. And he's just like, that was my American accent. That was my Bam accent. Probably Bam nowadays. Poor Bam. I feel bad for Bam. We won't go too hard into Bam's struggles, but poor Bam. So yeah, he's like your antagonist, and you go around different cities, and you've got to go and basically destroy bits of cities and antagonize the locals and things. So it's almost like, say, it's like an episode of Evil Bam / Jackass.
Yeah.
Which should be so in my wheelhouse. It should be. That is me. All my days. Tony Hawk's, Jackass, incredible music. This should be my fever dream. But it's not.
Oh dear.
And the reason for that is because almost like the story in this and the way that the characters act, and I'm not blaming Bam Margera for this, but some of the phrases used in a 2005 game, and it's just not on. It's just not meta cricket. Like, it is not okay. Like, I'm never offended. I was offended. I was so offended by this game, which is insane, because I'm like, oh, this should be. And it's funny, and this is where I want to get to in this point about Jackass, is that Jackass, everyone would say, if you look at Jackass, it's offensive. But they're never offensive to you. They're offensive to each other. Do you know what I mean? Like, what they do is they hurt each other, or they test things out. They test the limit of something. Like they test the limit of their friendship, they test the limit of what a human can do.
Yeah.
Like it's almost like they're always doing it to each other, and you're laughing at them. They're doing it for your comedy value. In this, like there is just some flagrant. I'm not even going to say it on the pod. That is in like it's so
that bad.
Yeah, it's that bad. That is in some of the words they use. I cannot believe that Neversoft released this game as they did, and I was like, that's fucking not on, man. That is in like it sounds pathetic, but I was really angered by it, if I'm going to be honest. Like I was triggered. I'm going to use that word. I was triggered by it, and I didn't expect to be, and that it really put me off the story mode. The story mode, like it was great that there was extra content there, but I played it for about 3 levels, and I was like, I don't need you anymore. I don't need your bullshit, and I'm not finding you fun or funny. And the idea that I've got to battle 2 teams and stuff, yeah, that was kind of a cool concept. Except one of the teams has been set up to act like an absolute set of shit houses. The one thing, like I will give an example, is that one of the contestants on Bam's team is a wheelchair-bound chap called Paulie, and he's a menace basically, but like he's in this nitro wheelchair and stuff, and they're kind of using it as a running joke that look what Paulie can do and stuff, and look at your character, you're like speaking to us, the player, look, you're just as bum, and Paulie can do this. If Paulie can do this, why can't you do this? And I'm like, what kind of example are you trying to set here, game? Like, I can't imagine that anybody. So I probably would have been about 15, 16 when this game came out, maybe. I could probably work it out, considering it was 2005. Yes, I was. It's been 17, and it's just like, so that's probably why I didn't play it, and I was kind of out with them a little bit by then. Just so weird.
That feels very much of its time, though, doesn't it? Because, I mean,
that's what I'm trying to defend Jackass a little bit here as an example, because whilst it is of its time, Jackass Forever came out last year and felt just as relevant as it did 20 years ago, because they've adapted, they've changed. Even when Jackass 3 came out in 2010 or 2011 and did the 3D things, it almost adapted, where it kind of, we are 10 years older now, so we do these kind of things. Or we're 20 years old now, so we do these kind of things, and we get these young guys to do this, and you still get the shit jokes, and you still get, but again, they always seem to be at each other. Now, I know you get the prank part of it, where you kind of offend the public and stuff like that, but it's very rarely, fuck you, mate, like in your face. Like, so it's very rarely, like, to the point where you're like, oh God, I feel really bad for that person because they've really, really hurt that person on purpose or something. It's never like that. Some of the shit that was in this game felt really hurtful.
Wow.
And it just didn't feel of it. I feel like saying if it's of its time is actually just defending something that was just outright awful.
Well, that is fair. That is a fair point.
So yeah, that really put me off. But in terms of like having, if you can get past that, I don't know what kind of person would, but if you could get past that, whoever you are, you're a wanker. If you can get past that, then you've got a large amount of content there. You've got a story mode and a classic mode. After what I've just said, I obviously slid back into the classic mode. It was actually quite high in difficulty level.
Was it?
And I don't know if that was just maybe the controls and getting used to the controls that had ported over to the PSP. Like I say, they've done a really good job, but trying to like balance a grind into a manual and get the combo, for example, like is in the combo goal. I found the combo goal, like, I can't even say it anymore. Isn't that the South American Football Association or Central American Association combo ball? Trying to get that initially straight away on the first level, I was like, I'm gonna have to try this 15 times before I get it. And I was like, and then when you get it, you get that satisfaction you get with Tony Hawk games where you're like, I've just nailed it.
I am a god.
Yeah. A really puny god on my tiny little handheld. But yeah, like once you got back into the classic mode, it felt like really good Tony Hawk, and you could ignore all the kind of bump around it. There's a multiplayer section, again, no one's on it, but to know that would have been there, with horse and things like that, to have all that there in your tiny little puny hands while you're, it was great that they managed to do all that. I was really impressed at the amount of stuff that got into this game, and still to make it look quite good and feel like Tony Hawk. So there was nothing wrong with the actual core game mechanics, but man, that game,
trappings.
I mean, like, just to end on the note that the menu is a wheel, like a wheel of fortune, but written in the middle of the wheel, it's the wheel of loogies or something like that, and that's in the main menu. And I'm like, I just don't get it. Like, who's laughing at that? Like, are you like a 7-year-old maybe? But then to be 7, you would have been born in 1998, 1 year before Tony Hawk Pro Skater came out. It just doesn't make sense. Who are you appealing to? You know, so I feel bad for any parents that they're like 10-year-olds play that game because it probably shaped them into be a right shithouse. So, yeah. So I guess all that said, a fine balance for that game, considering how much the story mode pissed me off. Like the actual playing the game, and if you just stick to the classic mode and the Tony Hawk, and obviously the controls in terms of using the directional pad, I'm going to have to go with a 6, which makes me feel really bad about the Tony Hawk game, because generally they're all really quite highly rated, in my opinion, certainly as well. But yeah, I think probably a 6 feels about right for that.
Nice. It's interesting you say about the kind of trappings and things like that, because it definitely feels like, from what I can remember of like Underground in particular, like the first one, they were definitely trying to tap into that kind of jackass side of things, and not necessarily too successfully.
No.
So yeah, I'm kind of pleased that when they redid, 1 and 2 more recently, they were just like, no.
Yeah, straight
not going to bother with the story. We'll just crack on with the gameplay. So I mean, for Olli Olli, it's kind of a similar thing where it definitely focuses on the gameplay, like it's king. So there's, I can't remember the number of could you call them levels? Yeah, you could call them levels. Off the top of my head, but there's certainly a few different themes. There's like spots and objectives to complete, and amateur and pro levels and things like that. And it all feels very sharp. It's almost like they kind of took the Tony Hawk's formula and distilled it down to the purest one they could make it. I can't remember exactly what year this came out in. I want to say maybe 2012-ish, very-ish. But obviously it's kind of gone on as a series and spawned a sequel and Olli Olli World, and kind of like what we were saying earlier and touching on was, it's grown and developed over time and kind of shifted and become something slightly different. This first version feels kind of like almost like a proof of concept, and I don't mean that as a bad thing, but you only have grinds and flip tricks to combo your way through these levels. And at times it almost feels like a kind of almost like an auto-scrolling platform game.
Okay.
For how accurate you have to be with it, and like the controls are sharp, right? But you have to time your landings and things like that, and the sort of the catching of grinds and things like that have an impact on your speed, and the whole thing is laser focused on getting you to play as close to perfectly as you can. And one of the things I liked about Tony Hawk, and one of the things that I guess the Underground games kind of did well, was that, like, if say one particular objective was proving a bit tricky, you can find something else to do. And on Olli Olli, you do have those options, but they are all basically the sort of same thing, which I know sounds really stupid for a skateboarding game, but like, it's there's what am I trying to say? Like, there's plenty of content in that the levels look slightly different, but ultimately and functionally they are all basically the same, and it feels very much like a first draft. I'm glad they did a sequel. I'm glad they did Olli Olli World, where there was more customization, there was slightly snazzier graphics, a better range of tricks. Like,
I may have just purchased Olli Olli World on the Switch tonight. It's on the Nintendo eShop for £15.
Ah, right.
So I mean, the expansion pack, the Rad edition, is £25. I couldn't expand my wallet this week to that amount, but yeah, I'm going to try out Olli Olli World because of, I guess, what I've read around Olli Olli, and Olli Olli 2, which apparently is, I mean, like, meant to be a real jump up in terms of like content and things, but everything stemmed from this game.
Yeah, and I think at the time it was certainly very, very well reviewed. and very highly regarded, bit of a kind of indie darling. For me, it feels like a kind of sort of 99% of the way there kind of a game. In fact, here's a good one for you. This is a pretty good illustration of what I'm thinking. So it falls foul of the touchscreen only menu problem, which seems to be plaguing anything that I'm playing on Vita, frankly.
Down with Vita!
So that in itself, because Olli Olli's menus are nice, clear, crisp, it's not too onerous, right? However, when you get into the game itself and you're going through, you will fuck up, right? You will crash and you'll need to restart. So the game has like a kind of quick reset option, and the restart button is always in the top left of the screen. So if you want to do a quick restart, you just tap the top left corner of the screen and you can reset. If you crash and you get the kind of stats and the options version of it, that button just gets bigger. You still have to press it. But because you can't navigate any of the menus using any of the buttons, because you're going through, and all the controls are X and the analog stick.
Yeah.
So whenever you're trying to stick a landing, you're pressing X or pushing down. So you're quite often tapping X. So when you want a quick reset, you want to be able to press X.
Yeah.
Like, it just naturally feels like you want to press X to get back into it quickly, but you can't. You have to tap the screen. Yeah. And so it's that kind of like, all the component parts are there. It's just that there's that one little tiny bit that's just holding it back from like just feeling
tiny but really annoying.
yeah, absolutely. And like there's another one where, like, because you've got to be so perfect with your timings and getting into some of these gaps, like some of the ground types change, and if you hit them, you bail, you scatter everywhere. That's fine, right? It might take a couple of attempts to work out what you can land on and what you can't land on, but that's broadly fine. The thing is that if you aren't perfect with your landings and you get like a sketchy landing, there is an animation that plays, like a canned animation, that will cock up any timings after that. So you can be penalised for rolling onto a piece of ground or into a piece of scenery for a landing that you did a couple of seconds prior, because this animation is playing out, and then you hit a thing and then you die. So it's not like you failed in that moment.
You're getting doubly penalised.
Exactly. You kind of failed. Like, the time to have worried about it would have been 10 seconds ago, 5 seconds ago. So it feels like it can be a bit delayed when it's like, oh, you were so close, but hey, look. And it's not even like, you could rescue a sketchy landing with a sort of slightly naff takeoff or anything like that, like a low ollie that doesn't go as far or something like that. And it's those sorts of things that feel like, with Olli Olli 2 and World, they started to iron out some of those kinks. Putting more options for keeping things going, in terms of tricks and gameplay and things like that, and keeping you hooked. So it is good. Like, I know it sounds like I'm bashing it a bit. Like, it is fun. When you go into a level and everything clicks, you manage to get, a great set of combos going, or you're doing a spot and you manage to get like a really decent score from just like one set of tricks. It can feel great, when it all comes together. But it's not a given. It's a bit ropey around the edges. It's kind of difficult to go back to nowadays.
I was going to say to you, actually, so whilst I was on the Nintendo eShop, I saw that Olli Olli was on there, Olli Olli 2 was on there, and also a Olli Olli Switch port. Now, the Olli Olli Switch port was about, I think it's £12. And I was thinking, do I want to start from the beginning before I jump straight into Olli Olli World and maybe get the Switch port of Olli Olli? But then it sounds to me like that probably just isn't the right thing to do. And therefore, why would they have ported it when they were going to get Olli Olli World in like a year's time afterwards?
I think if you haven't played any of the other ones, it does a job. It does a job well. For me personally, it started to stray into frustrating a little bit too often. And I mean, I like arcade style of games. I like that repetition and feeling like I'm learning something. But it's just occasionally just started to get a little bit too irritating for what it was trying to do.
Right. Okay.
And from what I can remember of Olli Olli 2, and I am doing this from memory, I haven't played it recently, but I do remember a lot of those sorts of issues started to get ironed out for me personally. So yeah, I it is a good game. It is fun. You can get a lot of enjoyment from it. But for me, it's a kind of short bursts, get a couple of goes in, and when it gets its sinks its claws in, like, it is something you want to keep playing. It's like, oh yeah, just one more go, but you will probably cock that go up, and it's not like Tony Hawk's where you can go do something else and still be playing the same game. So I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10, and like, rest assured that if you did pick it up, like, it would be fun. You would enjoy it.
Yeah.
But I think there are better Olli Olli games out there nowadays.
Okay, cool. It's funny because obviously when we started talking about doing this podcast, we talked about wanting to revisit retro game consoles, and we do need to, I guess, protect ourselves a little bit, because immediately I'm like, oh, you can get this on the Switch, you can get that on the Switch, and don't worry, the Switch will get its pop on this podcast at some point, because we both own one and we fucking love our Switches. But at the same time, we do have to still point out that these are retro games, and it's like, as long as you get enjoyment out of them still, like, you will see age in games. You do see age in games, and you go, well, why don't I just play the Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2 remake on Switch then? Well, actually, like, think about it from this point of view, I think that's probably still like £25 or something from the Nintendo eShop. If I bought a PSP console and that game, the Tony Hawk's Underground 2, and you can get Project 8 on, which I think is actually a bit of a superior game. It gets worse rated than Tony Hawk Underground 2, but I liked Project 8. But anyway, you can get like those games for like £3, £4. So for £44, you can get a games console and a game, compared to just playing the new one. It's like, well, actually, maybe you want to go do a little bit of retro gaming for quite a reasonable price, and that's what I guess I'm certainly feel like I'm trying to sell here with the podcast, is almost like, try out retro game consoles that don't cost too much now at the moment, certainly, and games that don't cost too much now at the moment, and maybe try those out, and you probably have just as good a time doing that. That is in maybe, yeah, you're looking at me really blankly.
No, I'm inclined to agree, and it's. Well, it's like we've said a few times now. There's a lot of different facets to like skateboarding, say, and you're not necessarily going to be able to have games that do all of those things on the latest consoles. So sometimes it is worth sort of looking back a little bit.
I guess so just coming to the end of our conversation, just a couple of bits. I know we've waxed lyrical a little bit about the music in terms of what is actually in the franchise of Tony Hawk early on. Was there any music in Olli Olli, or was it?
There was, yeah. Like, it was kind of like I was saying about Wipeout a couple of weeks ago. Like, it was functional.
Yeah,
did the job. Not necessarily anything that was going to leap out at me. I'm not going to do like I did with Tony Hawk's back in the day and start picking up CDs off the back of it. But yeah, perfectly fine. But also, just sort of there. Yeah. Sadly, to be honest with you, if it had a bit of a better soundtrack, I might have bumped this up to a 7. But yeah,
fair enough. And I guess that at that point, I would say the soundtrack for Tony Hawk Underground 2 is excellent. Like, as you would expect. Like, funnily enough, and that probably gave it 6 mark. I probably would have went a little bit lower even if that wasn't there. So, but we will be doing things on music in the future. Like we said, we alluded to, we're going to a festival at the end of the month together, and that'll be of a similar sort of ilk in terms of the music that comes out of the Tony Hawk franchise. So, in fact, Mill and Colin, who are on the first, is it the first or second game? I think Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2, I think they're on there. No Cigar, their single, that's on there. So I will be doing that thing where you go to a festival and you're like, I know this one song from this one band from that one time when I was young, and I'm going to wait for it, and then I'm going to know nothing else of their music, but just go, yeah, this is cool, man. That's what I'll be doing with all the bands, really, because I'm a bit lame like that. So let's finish up then. So on the spot, your favourite 3 skateboarding games that you've played. You don't have to go into it too much in terms of like, you know, like I guess sort of, you know, why and things like that. It's just almost like, yeah, this is it, and this is a quick sort of bit around that.
Yep.
What that made you feel.
I can do that. So first of them, Olli Olli. It is. I know I've just given it 6 out of 10. It is in my top 3. And that's not to say that there's a bunch of games that are like, oh, instantly shit because they're worse than 6 out of 10. That's not the case. Olli Olli is a pick up and play portable skating game, more than adequately does the job.
Yeah.
Yes, it's frustrating. Yes, it's bare bones. Yes, it's been surpassed. But my God, it served a purpose. Back in the day, like and it's a great idea. It's a great idea for a skating game. Sure, it's not what I get from skateboarding, but you know, it definitely fills a gap. Next on the list, I'm going to give that to Session. Been playing it recently, and it kind of has a similar sort of difficulty, for me at least, to Olli Olli, but for a very different reason. So like the controls are very specific. Like you've got to be good with the analog sticks and the timing. But for me, and what I was talking about earlier with the 2023 sort of chill hop skateboarding era, it captures that better than any other skateboarding game I've ever played. And that sense of, especially if you turn pedestrians and stuff like that off, that sense of being, you know, alone but not isolated, you and the obstacle in front of you and what you're going to do with it, and then just practicing that, and then you finally land it, and it feels great. Also, it's got Caspers in it, which, you know, as a trick that I love to fail at, earns it big points.
It's a well-named trick, though. That is badass, like, yeah.
But then my favourite one all time, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. Gameplay wise is razor sharp. There's plenty to do, but oh my God, that soundtrack just, if you had to basically take most of my musical tastes and distill it down to a single soundtrack, that is going to be close. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be close, and that is the root of all evil for a lot of my CD purchases over the years. So.
I think like that feeling of, like you said before, like Ace of Spades, for example, and dropping into that Canada level, like for the first time.
With
like,
CKY on.
Yeah. Oh, man.
As soon as 96 Quite Bitter Beings come on. I only know really, like, I mean, I know the song, but the first 2 minutes of it, like, I can almost tell you when you would get to the scoreboard on Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3.
I never really thought about that, actually. That you would,
when you get to the bridge in 96 Quite Bitter Beings,
you hit
your
run time. That's, do you know what? I've never put that together, I guess, really, like, in terms of, you know, that you would probably just hear a bit of a song. And I guess, is it every time you bail it changes, or you end your run, you change songs as well, so you probably only hear like 30 seconds sometimes when you got really frustrated and you're like, fuck off! That is in trying to, you know, find your secret tape and stuff, and you just miss the perfect run. So I am going to go for Skate 3 in my third slot. I think that I only played it like probably once through, I think, and yeah, I just a breath of fresh air at the time. That I'd never really played anything like it from a skateboarding point of view. I hadn't played Skate 1 or Skate 2. I just got told, play Skate. And I was like, but I'm scared of it. I'm scared of like what it's going to be. I'm scared of being bad at it. But actually, you don't need to be. That isn't. It just feels.
Love Skate 1.
Yeah. I mean, like I say, I've never played them. Never even played Skate 1 or Skate 2. But Skate 3, you know, played it through maybe once, and just, which felt like enough. Like almost like that doesn't sound like, you know, that doesn't sound like I'm giving it a really good review. It felt like a really perfect experience to have that one time where I'm like, wow, I've done that game and it felt great. You know, it's not going to be on that list of games where we're like, oh, well, I can't be asked finishing those games. I wanted to finish that game and I wanted to be good at it by the end of it. But then I was like, I'm done with that game, but I felt great about being done with that game. One game that I didn't finish, but felt good about, is Thrasher's Skate and Destroy, which I've referenced previously. So that came out, I think it came out the same year as Tony Hawk Pro Skater. It was like 1999, 2000. It looked graphically horrendous. That is, it did look very shit. Would be the best way of describing it. But it was like a real sim, almost like a Tony Hawk real sim. It was so hard to just even do an ollie. But that was like so much fun. Like, isn't it? It was just like, oh god. Especially, I'm sure it must have been after the after the first Tony Hawk game, and you then kind of had that juxtaposition where it was almost like they're both skateboarding games, and I've just played one and played the other, and I can do this one, and I'm having great time spinning around and twirling and everything. This one, I'm having a great time, and it's fucking ridiculously hard. Like, as in, I've been on like 3 ramps in about 6 hours, and I can't do anything. That's great, like, as in, it was just like real life, Yeah, and again, that just kind of came at a time where it was like, I'd sort of, 12 years old, I think, drinking small little bottles of like 1% beer and stuff around at a friend's house, playing on that, just, fun times.
Nice.
And, I'll do the same thing as you. I'll pick a Tony Hawk, just because, as you can probably tell from this podcast, that's kind of like where you'd learn most things about skateboarding games, really, is that, if you haven't played a Tony Hawk, can you go over and play other skateboarding games? Of course you can, legitimately, but can you? Is what I'm saying. Like, if you've not span around doing like a 1080, like,
you haven't busted out a Christ air.
Yeah, have you played skateboarding games? I'm gonna go Tony Hawk 2. And that game was probably the most played game on my PlayStation, I'd say. Just rinsed the shit out of that game, and probably the most played level was maybe even like the school level. I think it's like second level in, and the amount of times I've rung those bells on that level, and I think that I didn't enjoy the remake of 2 as much as I enjoyed just playing 2. That is in, whereas I enjoyed the remake of 1 more, and I think that's probably because I didn't play 1 as much. Whereas like I had a very pure mindset of what Tony Hawk's 2 was like, and the remake was a bit like the level design was a bit different, and that different enough for me to be like, this isn't quite my Tony Hawk's 2.
That's fair.
So but that game is just. I'm going to call it. It's the first game that I'm going to talk about probably over this podcast run that I'm saying it's an essential game. It is an essential game that I think that everybody should play. So, full stop. You can't get out of it. Sorry, I'm putting people in a headlock, giving them a nuggie, and I'm like, play that fucking game. That's what I'm doing, and I love you all, but I'm doing it to you. So, you're all in that headlock.
Fun fact: I've never played it. I've never played it. However, I used to
end the podcast.
Cliff, major moment.
It doesn't reside in your house right now.
No.
What?
No, I've got the Game Boy Advance version.
Oh.
I played the absolute ever-loving shit out of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 on the Game Boy Advance.
Oh, I feel sad. I'm melting in my chair. I'm wounded. This whole podcast is saying how
I'm living a life as
much kinship we had, and you're just a bastard, right? Well, but you're my bastard.
Yep.
Well, there we go.
On
then.
that bombshell.
Yeah, no, I don't know what to say anymore. Wow. Okay. End the pod. Right. Olli, Olli, Olli.
Oi, bye.